and welcome to Huddle Breakdown with me, Laura Bradburn. I am joined as always by James. Still no Alan this week. His return is imminent. I do promise people that.
1 week to go.
1 week to go. We've not put him on gardening leave or anything like that. He is definitely coming back. James, how are you?
I'm okay. And to give the audience a little bit of a peer behind the curtain, we're recording a day early. We usually record on Tuesdays for release overnight, Tuesday into Wednesday. Laura was gracious enough to change her schedule in order to accommodate me this week. I'm excited because my 20-year-old daughter, our 20-year-old daughter, asked me to go somewhere, which, you know, when you're a parent and kids get in the teenage years, early 20s, it's like, so we're going to do something tonight and into tomorrow together as a father-daughter. So thank you for accommodating. Even now, I also say that to the audience because if something breaks, like 100 signings in the next 24 hours, that we will not have referenced it in this recording because this is getting recorded Monday evening. And
also because at this point on Monday evening, there's not even a sniff of anything. It's not even as if we are imminently awaiting something.
No, perhaps the 17th offer for Broom at 3.15827 million euros, up from like 100 grand more. So that might be the only news we get.
Yeah, that'll be about it. We're going to do a little bit of an interesting exercise this week. We got a lot of positive feedback from the analysis that James had done, and people seem to enjoy that. So in the absence of any current news during this window, and with still a couple of weeks to go, or a week to go until the season starts, we're going to do a little bit of in-depth analysis, but this time less numbers and more words. James, what are you thinking?
Oh, God help us. Yes, I wrote a column just released on at huddlebreakdown.com, my weekly column I do. And it was basically using an old, well, it's not a quote necessarily from Maya Angelou. It was recounted as a quote in a conversation between Maya Angelou and Oprah Winfrey. And I'm going to bring that back to look at the controlling shareholders' September 18th interview released, at least it was released in 2020, September 18th, 2020 in The Athletic. So talk about a riddle. I'm going to tie those all together, and we're going to walk through that a little bit and what I wrote about in the column, because I think it does shed light on what's going on this window and just kind of contextually what's going on at Celtic. So that was the goal anyway. So we'll walk through that.
Yeah, I think to set the scene where we're at the moment, myself included, there's a lot of, I don't want to say hysteria, because hysteria would suggest that there isn't a basis for it, but there is certainly a lot of concern amongst the Celtic support about the lack of, either the lack of activity in the transfer market this summer, or the fact that everybody can see with their own eyes that we are sitting with a squad that is significantly weakened from the end of last season to now. And I guess your column is looking into some of the reasons why that might be, or some of the lessons that we need to learn from, you know, this Groundhog Day of a pre-season, I suppose.
That's right. Yep. That's the goal. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, lots of words, less numbers, more words today. And then, and then we'll talk a little bit about the game on the weekend, that rip snorter in Como that everyone was so enthralled with against the Saudi team that I won't pretend to pronounce, Al Ali or something.
Yeah, it's Al Ali. So I did watch that game, and I did watch I watched the first half of the Ajax game. I ended up getting a phone call from a friend, so I thankfully missed the second half of the Ajax game. Came downstairs and my dad said, "Did you not see anything of what happened?" And I saw the scoreline, thought, thank God, no. But I think the weirdest thing about the Al Ali game for me, skipping the entire performance, was the fact that I don't think the players even realised there was a penalty shootout after the match. Everybody was kind of walking about going, what's going on here? It was the weirdest thing ever.
Yeah, I certainly didn't anticipate that. So, that was a kind of a weird thing. And I will admit, you got a phone call at halftime of the Ajax game I had a couple of extra beverages Friday night, and so I dozed off at halftime of Saturday's game, and came to about maybe 10, 15 minutes into. So it was a little power nap, But so yeah, I missed, and it wasn't important enough. So I missed. I think it was the offside goal of Yamada was in that window that everyone was talking about, and I was like, do I really care enough to go back and find that and look at it? And I was like, nah. If it was a competitive game, then I would have done it. But it's just too much.
Listen, I'm going to spring this on you because I like to do that, and feel free to skip it because I know you like to have your analysis to hand before you answer these questions. But can you possibly answer for me how Marco Tilio ended up at Celtic? Because I genuinely, I only a couple of weeks ago said that I thought Kwon played like he was a competition winner in the Athletic Bilbao testimonial for James Forrest. Tilio, I'm actually one of the few Celtic supporters who've seen him play for Celtic in the flesh. I was at a Celtic Hibs match last season at some point, and he somehow ended up on the park, I'm sure. But against Al Hilal, anytime the ball went out to him, he ran into dead ends, he would trip over the ball, he would run and forget that he was supposed to take the ball with him. Like, I think people underestimate how much work goes into identifying players that you want to sign. And what I can't believe with Tilio is, given how difficult we find it to sign players and get the thing over the line, how has he ended up at Celtic Park?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. There's a overly reductive way to use quote unquote data, which is if guys post things like XG and XA, meaning that particularly as a winger, somebody who does posts a decent amount of volume in those metrics. Palma was another one, where I think a relatively unsophisticated way of analyzing things just from data could lead you down bad paths as far as drawing conclusions. So, I believe he played at a relatively, that's within the context of the A-League, which is a pretty flat league, as I call it, meaning that because it's salary cap, it's not like there's PSG versus the 20th team in Liga. It's flatter than that as far as the standard. But he was still on a pretty dominant team, one of the better teams historically. So it's one of these things I talk about, the attribution of the team effects and the competitive dynamics based off of resources, and then how much is like the idiosyncratic player stuff. And I think a lot of the systemic stuff gets misattributed to players. So if you just throw any striker playing at Celtic against bottom six teams, they're going to score a lot of goals. Like, I always say any, meaning that any that's going to be even within the realm of pot. I mean, throw me in there, it's obviously not going to happen, but you know what I mean? Like professional wage bill level slot that you would be signing, most of them are going to score a decent amount of goals because of the competitive dynamics. You're going to get a ton of chances, and they'll be okay. So I think some of it had to do with misattribution. The other part, and again, just to be charitable to him, it's like his last shot kind of thing. He could have been trying too hard, trying to force things. It kind of looked like that to me a little bit, just as a kind of anecdotal, qualitative assessment. And I get that. Like, he's in a tough spot. I mean, it sounds like from reports this week that he and Yang seems like they've had deals kind of killed for now by Brendan because we have no one else to play wing. So understandably, the manager's like, well, I have no wings. Maybe we shouldn't sell the guys that we do have that play that position, even if I don't want them here long term. So there could also be that factoring in, again, just on a human level, some confusion or unsettling for him. But yeah, he certainly has not lived up to any kind of billing that would make you think, he's in the Quan. I would argue the Yang, Palma, the long list of players that were just like, what happened? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I've not heard anything concrete about Yang, but certainly a couple of weeks ago it was pretty much nailed on that I think Tilio was supposed to be going to Rapid Vienna in Austria, and that kind of, to the point where I almost assumed it had been confirmed and was very surprised to see him on the team sheet against Al Hilal because Al Ali, just because I thought I thought it was a done deal. I thought he was away, so it wouldn't surprise me given that was kind of the shared not wisdom that maybe Brendan has stepped in and said, "Listen, we can't sell these guys until we have somebody in place." And there's also been comments that he's been making suggesting that at the current point where the squad finds themselves, Yang is considered the starting starting winger on the right. So. Yeah, how did we end up here? I don't know. I guess I think that's a good segue to get into your article. And this is not a question I thought I would ask you on the huddle breakdown, but what exactly was it that Maya Angelou said to Oprah?
Yeah, well, that's leads, and I have the words here. So, geez, here I put in the wrong one.
Yeah, I don't remember Oprah calling anybody Lenny.
There we go. Yeah, I apologize. Joy, boy, I hit the wrong button. This is still the early stages of using this technology, so apologies. But yes, I'll read this because I'm not going to read everything that I post. If people watching, you kind of scan through. We'll post these as we have been on huddlebreakdown.com for people that are listening on audio through your podcast catcher or through the Substack app. But again, this was recounted by Oprah in an interview in 2011 within the context of her having a conversation with Maya Angelou. And, for people who don't know about Oprah, she's been big on like self-help and self-improvement over the years. So I think it was in that kind of context. But so this is Oprah recounting what Maya Angelou said to her. "My dear, when people show you who they are, why don't you believe them? Why must you be shown 29 times before you can see who they really are? Why can't you get it the first time?" And I think, it's as we go through these transfer windows, it's like, how many times it's like some people have referred to it as Groundhog Day, understandably. But as I was kind of processing what to talk about today and coming out of the presentations that I did with you and then with Martin last week, I kind of came about, I don't know why that quote or the concept, when somebody tells you who they are, believe them. That's the other way that people have kind of colloquially distilled that message down. And that made me think back to the September 2020 interview that controlling shareholder at Celtic had with The Athletic. And he's not one to talk publicly very often, particularly about Celtic. So I revisited it just to read it again, because I'd read it at the time, and I may have read it one more time after it, but it was not fresh to memory. And when I went through it, it just was like, that idea just kept coming back to me. This when they tell you who they are, believe them. And so what I did in my article today that was released on Monday, I should say, was kind of walk through vignettes, anecdotes in the article, quoting from the controlling shareholder himself, how he characterized various things, because I think it really does help paint a picture as far as what's happening at Celtic right now. And I think it unclouds some of the confusion and a bit of the mess that we all kind of perceive and I think feel. And it's partly because it's the 29th time. I mean, it's, we all kind of keep thinking that this may not be the case, but it kind of seems like it does. So I'm going to bring up the next quote that I cited in the article. And I don't know why it's doing this. That's odd. Okay. So in this part, he references, how strong the board members are and references the focus on intellectual capital over financial capital. So this basically characterizes the idea that he wants Celtic to be self-sustaining financially. As I've said, I applaud this. Like, this is the continuation of the Fergus McCann legacy in my mind. It's kind of how I think about it anyway. And then I think the part to take away from this that really is applicable to this summer in this upcoming season is, and I'll read this part, "We've adopted Mr. Micawber's economics." You know the one. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditures, 19, and 6. So basically, and that result is happiness. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, £20, and 6. Result is misery. So it's basically, if your annual, if you're working on an annual basis where you're going to have a net savings and you're going to systematize that, and as they say in personal finance, pay yourself first, be a systematic saver. And again, I applaud all of this. Like that, I agree with that. Particularly on a personal finance basis, people that are habitual savers typically do a lot better rather than people that get into debt. So, and by the way, and I joked in the column, if you're a troglodyte like me or a literary ignoramus, that comes from Charles Dickens' work, David Copperfield. I'm going to read it here because I don't know. Wilkins Micawber is the character. I've never read the book. I'll throw my hand up.
Listen, David Copperfield to me conjures images of elephants being magically disappeared and the Statue of Liberty disappearing and all that kind of thing. So yeah,
that's
I'm
the only one I know.
Forward.
Yep. We're the highbrows people here. But yeah, so this idea of being systematically conservative and making money and saving some every season, I think fits. Like this is how Celtic are run. And if you think about it, the only time I would argue since, he took a controlling interest back in 99 into 2000, that you could say they went outside of that comfort level, that kind of Micawber economics framework, was the 10 in a row season. When, I went through this with Martin I didn't specifically cite it, but it was in the graphic from last week, that there was an operating loss in a season when there was lockdowns, no fans in stadiums. And we had a net spend that summer that was one of the highest of that period with the controlling shareholder effectively in control. So that was like pushing the boat out, and within this framework, like I'm not saying it was Rangers maniac tax cheat level of David Murray nut job gambling and illegalities, but within the context of an institution that's adopted this Micawber economics culture, to do what they did in that season was really pushing the boat out, particularly within the risks of that time. And if you think about that, it didn't turn out real well. So one could see someone who has this philosophy that maybe wasn't all that comfortable. I could see, I'm speculating here, with pushing the boat out into an environment that's very risky. No one knew what was going to happen at that point with the pandemic, et cetera. And if it turns out terrible, you might go back to your priors. You might say, hey, maybe I should stick with the formula that's worked my entire life and what I believe in. So I thought that this was a very important part of the article because it does provide that context as far as, regardless of how much money's in the bank, it's about the plan of annual responsibility. And I think that's likely to be part of what's going on the last few seasons. And
I think that will always be the argument from anybody within the Celtic boardroom in response to, the fans clamouring for money to be spent. The argument in response to that will always be, we want a sustainable model. We want a club that actually continues to exist in a market where we can't generate the same revenues as clubs in other countries and things like that. So that's where the frustration comes as a supporter, is because that is a very reasonable point in and of itself, but surely there must be some sort of happy medium in between what we feel they're doing and what we feel they should do.
Yeah, my criticism has nothing to do with anything that we've gone over so far. I think it's reasonable to have that Micawber type of mentality. I disagreed a lot with what went on in that summer of 2020, but that wasn't because of the financial decisions. In my view, it was more so, the recruitment decisions, the managerial decision, and again, we'll get into a little bit that in a few minutes. But so yeah, I think it's an issue of the piling up of the cash, whether it was, planned and whether it was part of a strategic plan that you would have something to do with. Because as I mentioned with Martin on, Thursday when we were recorded, and again, that was behind a paywall for people that didn't see it. The idea is that's, let's say it's, I don't know, 80 million in cash that's roughly sitting there. And it's hard to know with season ticket money and everything, what's actually free cash versus encumbered cash when they do the June 30th statements that'll come out probably in September, October. But so let's just say for conversation's sake, it's 80 million. Well, if I don't know what their cash management yield is in the UK right now specifically, but let's say it's 4%, again, just for simplicity, 3 or 4%. All you need to do is hit a hurdle rate of something higher than that relative to player trading. And it's kind of like, okay, well, it's a better use of capital than to just let it sit there getting, nominal 4%, let's say, and then have to pay tax on that yield. So again, businesses that create capital like that strategically, where they kind of expected it, usually have a plan for it, not to sit there for 2 or 3 years, not really doing anything. So I think that's, so I'm more critical of that than the conservatism that led to it. It's what's the plan, and whether there was like an active strategy that helped create that surplus capital, so to speak. So, let's move to the next one. Let's see if it jumps up here. This is going to be the correct one. Nope. There we go. All right.
See, if you're listening on audio, we could have just skipped that whole bit, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm hitting the correct button here. It's something squirrely going on here, but so I'm not going to read all of this. I'm going to summarize it. But for people who, there'll be a link to the column. I think it's free. I don't think it's behind a paywall anymore at The Athletic. It's now part of the New York Times. So we'll put that in the show notes, and it's linked in the column for subscribers that read what was put out on Monday. But basically, what this section that I've quoted here references is, and Peter Lawwell talked about this regularly in public as well, and in written, comments, is that whether it's in annual statements or whatever, annual reports, is this kind of expectation, the aspiration of being an elite operating football club across departments, having high KPIs. So you want to win all the trophies, you want to succeed in Europe, really constantly striving for excellence. I think before we went live, Laura, you said that's kind of what people would want to hear all the time. And quite frankly, that's usually the BS that most corporate management spreads, whether they know what they're doing or not. Like that's standard. As I joke with my lovely wife who works in the corporate world, I say that's like standard MBA douche speak. Like that's what, when you go to get your MBA, you learn how to speak like a douche like this, KPIs and all this stuff. So, but I don't have my MBA, by the way, thank God. But
you're just a douche.
I'm just a douche. Yeah, I didn't have to spend $100,000 and 2 years learning to be a douche. I was born that way. But so the other part of this, so this lays out the importance of an aspirational culture and high standards. Let's put it that way to summarize. And then the bottom part of it, I'm going to read this part. And this was a quote from the controlling shareholder. That's what's so good at Celtic. We're unified. We don't have recrimination. We're not here to fire somebody or blame someone. We take collective responsibility. So again, the culture here is high expectations, and we're all in this together. Right. Now, we're not going to fire individuals. So again, I think that's important to understand relative to the context of this time, which was, things were going pretty well still at this point into 2020. It was about 3 weeks after this, we started to fall off the cliff. But it also speaks to why they were, I would argue, very slow to sack Lennon, Neil Lennon at the time, was because.
And I think it's one of these situations where it's very easy to have a philosophy when everything is going well. Right. It's only when things start going wrong that you have to test your philosophy, or it becomes tested involuntarily, that you have to then assess, it's very easy to say we have a collective responsibility here. But if there's an individual person, and I'm not talking necessarily about the manager, I'm talking about anybody within the club, if there's an individual person or individuals who are responsible for a certain failure, then you would have to suggest that it's not a collective responsibility, then it is the failure of that individual. If the canteen staff keep burning the food, that's nobody else's responsibility but the canteen staff.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and then we'll get to this a little bit later, which is this idea. I mean, I like that from a team building perspective. That's everyone kind of rowing in the same direction. That's all good. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, where's accountability for individual performances? That this is, I would think, not a Marxist framework in operating a competitive modern football club where you're competing for limited resources and points aren't allocated based off of equal fairness. It's, you have to earn it and that kind of thing. So if no one's ever getting fired or if you're never changing someone for not doing their job well enough, if you're not meeting KPIs, are you firing everybody? Is this a binary thing? Like if you don't meet KPIs, everyone gets fired or nobody gets fired? I don't know. It kind of seems a little clouded to me in practice.
And if nobody is meeting their targets and is working in an environment where they know that there is no pressure to meet those targets, then they will naturally become less motivated to try and meet those targets, because what are the consequences of not doing so? And everybody might say, well, you don't need targets to be a motivated individual. No, you don't. But they certainly help. And I think human beings are human beings psychologically. If you know there's no consequences to your actions, sometimes you will take actions that you might not otherwise take.
Yeah, and what I know about people that are and have studied behavior and success is that it's about routine and about systematizing good behavior as opposed to goal setting. Now, goal setting is not bad, but you can say we're going to be great at all this stuff. Like our goal is to be awesome, like super duper awesome. That's the goal. Universally super duper awesome is the goal. Well, just saying it isn't going to make it happen. The people that actually are awesome typically have a system of discipline, like Micawber economics. That's a system that leads to financial success longer term, more so than not. It's not just saying, I want to have $1 million in 100 years, in 20 years. It's, you got to save like 15, 20% of your income to get there as a normal kind of working person, if that's the goal. You can't just say, I'm going to, that's the goal and not have a plan. So, yeah, I think, so again, I thought that was interesting contextually, and we'll circle this back at the end as we wrap all this up, because when it comes back to accountability, if it's shared with everybody, then I think that's a different conversation, about how do we go forward if KPIs aren't being met. So we'll move to the next one. I know it's now going to be wrong. I'm going to have to click twice because I am, there we go. So this one, this was the really crazy one that clipped. And this gets into more of the conversation about, again, put this in context. This was following the loss to Ferencváros, which knocked us out of the Champions League. So we had basically entered the 10 in a row season. We kept Ayer, we kept Christie, we kept Edouard. There was, pretty widespread reports that all three wanted to leave that summer. They were told they weren't allowed to. At least that's what I've heard and read, and I think a lot of people have. And again, we spent the money on Barkas, Ayeti, brought in an expensive loan on Duffy. We really geared up for all this, and then we lose to Ferencváros. Everyone remembers how horrible that was in August. So this is shortly thereafter. So the journalist understandably queries a little more about this European excellence or success part of the success laid out by the controlling shareholder in the interview. So he talks more about that, and this is, to me, was like, to me, there's, again, no other way to say it, but kind of crazy, which he lays out his belief that the talent on the team it wasn't because of talent. It wasn't because of the quality of the team. He thinks, or thought at the time, that team was better than the 2003 Seville team under Martin O'Neill, i.e. it had more talent, it was a better team, and that the problems that Celtic had been having in Europe in recent history were because of mental blockages, mental issues, confidence, things like that. And then he goes on about how great O'Neill and Gordon Strachan were in building confidence in players. And so it was his whole heuristic for analyzing why Celtic have underperformed dramatically in European competitions for, outside of that little period under O'Neill, arguably for the entirety of his custodianship of the club, with a couple of blips under Strachan and Lennon. To me, that just speaks volumes to a very antiquated view of analyzing football. It's like I would love to put him and Tony Bloom in a room and have them have a conversation about how they analyze football and see how that went. Because I just think
the one thing I will say, looking at this particular page, is he talks about the fear factor in Europe and says, we will address this by asking what the fear factor is in Europe. We'll learn how to get over our fear of failure by bringing in experts to help us. I do think Celtic have a psychological issue in Europe. I do think there is a strange sort of inferiority complex when it comes to playing against any team, and Celtic do appear to, I think, much more so nowadays than in years gone by, go into games thinking they're the underdog, even when they probably shouldn't be. What I hope has happened off the back of that, with the comment about experts coming in to help them, is in the 5 years since, there has been things like sports psychology getting involved, all that kind of thing. But and so I take that at face value. The comments suggesting that the squad of 2020 were in any way better than the squad that got to Seville is, for me, just, I can't say anything else other than I just think it's completely incorrect.
Yeah, crazy, ludicrous. I'm a little more outlandish with my language, but so this goes back to these qualitative factors through an analytical lens. And as I've said this till I'm blue in the face, is that they exist, they are important on the margins, but the idea, and I think what you're describing is absolutely 100% the elephant in the room amongst the support. We all go into these ties thinking, oh my God, here we go again in Europe, because we've been conditioned to do that, over 20 years, let's say. Not quite 20
even,
years,
and I'm not talking about your Bayern Munichs and your Barcelona.
Right, no,
I'm talking about
Bodo Glimt, baby.
Yeah. Teams that we should really be on a level with or better than, and we're still panicking that we'll do the Celtic thing of managing the game for 89 minutes and then conceding 2 goals and being out of the competition within the blink of an eye, because it's such a repetitive aspect of the way that we play in Europe.
Yeah, and I have no doubt that feeds back into the players as well, either in the stadium, I should say in the stadium, and the local media. I mean, these people are not isolated from culture and social media and that type of stuff.
Let me just stop you there, James. You can't actually talk about it in the stadium. Only us season ticket holders can talk about that. So, sorry, you're just not allowed to comment on that. Thank you.
I apologize. I'll leave that up to you, as I should. I overstepped my bounds. I apologize. But so you 100%, like it's a human aspect that on the margins, these things will impact confidence and all of that. But the idea that is preeminent, that is the dominant factor, that the team was more talented. And again, this is before everything that blew up subsequent. The idea that Shane Duffy was signed as an expensive loan to play a ball-playing center back in a high line with Scott Brown running around like a headless chicken in front of him at 36 years old.
Oh my God, you're inducing flashbacks.
I know, but the idea that those were the main issues and not all the things that I just mentioned, the weighting of it is what I'm getting at. And that, things like selection, recruitment, the fact that we recruited Barkas to play in a 3-5-2 and then never played 3-5-2 with him. And, when he did play, he was a solo striker in a 4-2-3-1 or 4-3-3, like those kind of things, like logical incoherence as far as squad building, selection, tactics, and how these things weren't kind of synced up. And that how that's been systemic at Celtic And there's other issues like our ability to scale the aggressive playing style against better teams, and it even mentions in the story about how counterattacking's been a problem. That even at that time that Brendan Rodgers in his first tenure we struggled with at times, which was true. By the way, I would say it was also similar midfield issues during those tenures as well, as far as personnel and how they were used. Again, I was never blaming Scott Brown for how he was asked to play by the manager, despite his age. He actually went on to play a very productive season at Aberdeen, by the way, as a sitting midfielder, where he didn't run around like a headless chicken. So he was capable of doing it, and he was excellent at Aberdeen, his final season.
What I'll say about that in defence of Scott Brown, and mark your calendars, everybody, I'm about to defend Scott Brown here, which is not common. But I was actually watching... I think it was some of the classic matches between, like at half time on Celtic TV during the Al Ahly match, and one of them was a Scott Brown featuring match from like quite early on in his Celtic career.
He's playing winger.
Yeah, well, pretty much. Like I think what unfortunately happened with Scott Brown was he came as a kind of box-to-box dynamic midfielder and was very effective at that for the first, probably even the first, I don't know, 7 or 8 years of his career at Celtic, and then continued to play that way past the point of his legs being gone. And that's when he should have been utilised more as a sitting midfielder than he was. He did do it occasionally, but I think there was still too much of expected of him in terms of mobility that he couldn't give past the age of 32 or 33.
Yeah, I know. I agree with that. And we talk about that similar conversation with Kyle McGregor now, and actually how his utilization last year. Al and I applauded it last season. He looked more central. He wasn't being asked to move around as much because of these issues with transition and counterattacking. And that was part of the reason why we did a better job, I think, in Europe last season, was because it's more resilient. Other than that headless chicken game in Dortmund, which we won't get into that. But so again, we'll kind of work through here. So we got these high KPIs. One of them, success in Europe. We're not hitting that. And what's the reason is psychological, because the talent's awesome. So if I'm someone who's involved with running a club and maybe involved more in recruitment than is commonly known, I have a good way to make myself feel good about the job I'm doing. It's not the players we're signing or the ones that we forced to stay in the middle of a pandemic and lockdown away from their families. They just have this mental block. It's this thing. So to me, it's a weighting issue and not real positive as far as a heuristic for running a modern football club or any sporting enterprise. So we move to the second to last, and this one's important because I think, again, relative to that collective responsibility comment in the prior section, he goes into a soliloquy here about his high regard for Neil Lennon, which again, I have no opposition to that. Like that's his personal relationship. He held him in high regard. It was very flattering of him in his comments, which also speaks to why they were probably so slow in discharging him from his duties. But then he goes into explaining the receptive, as part of this flattering of Lennon, he goes into explaining a conversation that he had shortly after, within a couple of days of the 5-0 victory by Celtic in Dingwall against Ross County, where he felt that the performance actually wasn't very good, even though the result was 5-0, and, describes in the article about how receptive Lennon is to that kind of feedback and talking about performances and not just results, that kind of stuff. And then the journalist lists at the end, I'm not quoting the controlling shareholder here, I'm quoting the journalist part. He says, Desmond and Lennon's Ross County chat reveals a level of daily engagement from the former that will surprise a few in Scotland. Okay. So this speaks to, and this is where I'll throw in a little bit more context here. I encourage people that if you don't subscribe to Graham Spears' podcast, it is a subscription behind paywall at Patreon. But he had Andrew Smith on, who's at Celtic Underground now, and I want to say it was in mid-May. Basically, the whole conversation was about Andrew's experience with the controlling shareholder, and actually an interview that he had with him years ago when he was working at the publication from the club. And in that conversation, I encourage people that can get access to it to go ahead and do it. It's worth hearing the whole. I think it was about an hour, but part of it, and I'll summarize it. I summarized it in my piece a little bit. Is, Desmond's not interested in having a high profile. Like he's a lot more engaged. This whole absent landlord narrative that has built up is probably something. This is me speculating. Probably he welcomes it based off of what Andrew characterized in that conversation, meaning that he's just fine not having to deal with any of the social blowback of having a high profile relative to active decision making that impacts how the product on the pitch manifests. So it's almost like that discretion, and there's this mystery about his involvement seems to suit him, probably, is my guess. And that's kind of what I walked away from Andrew's descriptions of his interactions. And that also fits with everything that we've kind of gone through here. So going back to the original quote, or the theme from Angelou is, when they tell you who they are, believe them. I mean, this is, like, to me, a body of, description here that kind of paints a picture of the person who's pulling a lot of the strings at the club, kind of how they see the sport, what their role is. They're very engaged. And, this leads to the last slide. Well, let me stop there. Did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, no, I think that particular part of the article sort of confirmed something that people suspected all along about members of the board perhaps having more input and more daily engagement with the manager, as they say, than you would perhaps expect at a club either of that size, or that you would imagine doesn't happen at other clubs. Obviously,
you mean a non-executive director who does not have a majority shareholder, who's not actually the owner of the club, just has a routine conversation with the manager after, that really tight victory in Dingwall against the biggest rival that you're ever going to have, that nail-biting game that absolutely there had to be a conversation with the manager about. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, because I would suggest that if that kind of conversation is going on about that game, there's a possibility, and again, I'm speculating here, that there are all sorts of conversations going on about other matches that are more dissatisfactory or more vital to the season as a whole. But that's just speculation. Why don't we go on to the last part of the game of the article before wrapping things up? Because this I think is very, very interesting, considering, to put it back into context for anybody who wasn't sure, we are talking about an article that was published in 2020, and we are sitting in the summer of 2025. I'll leave it to you, James.
Yeah. Well, so towards the end of the article, it's not at the very end, but because it gets into about his stake in Shamrock Rovers and some other things. But really, the conclusion of the piece, relative specifically to Celtic. So the journalist writes, "What next? What is Desmond's vision, Celtic vision for 2025?" So again, like, back to NBA douche speak. What's your 5-year plan, man? Like, what's your strategic plan? Well, this is a quote from Desmond. Quote, "I'd like to be able to say that in 5 years' time, our team is better than any of the great teams that were led by Martin, Gordon, Brendan, and Lenny." Close quote. So, to wrap this up, as I've walked through this today, if there's a collective responsibility for whether that KPI has been met and whether success in Europe, a durable basis, all of the benchmarking that we went through last week relative to where Celtic financially on a player trading basis, what's going on with all of this bloated balance sheet, all of this excess cash, it's just sitting there. Like, I don't know, like who's accountable ultimately? It seems to me that the person who's making most of the decisions, most of the big decisions, should be the one most accountable. And that becomes a problem when that person believes in, apparently, collective responsibility when he's the one most responsible. So what do you do when that person's not doing a good job? I don't know. That's a problem. And it's a problem that other big, and I've mentioned this before, this is not unique to football. It's not unique to Celtic. There's plenty of other examples in other sports with very wealthy, smart, very successful individuals own teams and are very active in the running of those teams, much to the detriment of the performance of those sporting enterprises on the field. Some of them do very well financially, as I always mention the Dallas Cowboys. They've done incredibly well financially, and they have not been relevant on the American football field for, I think, going on 25 years now, something like that. But that Jerry Jones is still helping draft those players every April. He's heavily involved in those NFL drafts for the Cowboys.
The fact I know the name Jerry Jones tells you everything you need to know, given the fact that I know next to nothing about NFL, but I do know who Jerry Jones is.
Yeah. So hopefully we met the goal today, which is to, if not, we're not here to solve anything, obviously, but to help provide a little bit of context for why what is happening. And quite frankly, not to expect some great shift to come out, because he's laid out who he is. I think we should believe this is who he is. You
know what's going to happen? They're going to announce Kylian Mbappe tomorrow or something like that, and we're going to look like absolute mugs. But I'll close things out by saying thank you very much, James, for breaking that down. To read James's full article, obviously go and subscribe on huddlebreakdown.com, where you'll also get access to the second show of the week that we do with Martin, as well as all previous shows and all written articles by both James and Alan. And I guess the one piece of engagement that I would like to ask our viewers to do is comment underneath. Looking at that last KPI, do you think we've met it? Do we have a better squad in the summer of 2025 than any of the ones from Martin, Gordon, Brendan or Lenny? For once, I'm speechless, James.
That's a good way to end it.
Thanks very much, guys. Bye-bye.